Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
In one world there was a gemstone called Ramian. For many generations it was passed down only to the eldest sons of the Bertrand family. This stone protected all its guardians. However, if a new heir died, the color of the stone changed to black. This story begins in the summer of the year 1201 and originates in the castle of Duke Bertrand, Lord of Lorraine. A girl named Rolie Badiviere, who was the daughter of the mercenary Badiviere, wielded a sword as she always did. She was at her morning training session, and when she defeated her fictional opponent again, she realized it wasn't as easy as she thought it would be. She thought it would be easy enough, but she was really wrong. All her hands were blistered and sore. Even though her hands were pretty much scarred and sore, it was still fun for her. In the past, to her, a sword had always been just an ordinary tool for cutting vegetables. However, Duke Bertrand decided to teach her how to hold a weapon in her hands. Ancient languages, theology, philosophy, piano, and sword fighting. He sacrificed absolutely everything for her education. And the girl thought that she must certainly live up to his expectations. This man had too kind soul, and he always treated Rolie well. While she was standing there thinking about it, she suddenly heard some noise nearby in the bushes, so she immediately turned around to check what was there. As soon as the girl did so, she saw a boy behind her. It was Ethan Seymour Burton, who was the Duke's only son. She immediately went up to him and bowed and said hello. But there was an awkward silence between them, because no one knew how to begin the conversation. Then Rolie decided to speak first, and wondered if he had something wrong, since he had come to her so suddenly. The man was quiet for a while, said he thought she was getting into a little trouble. The girl did not object and said that it was indeed true. The sword was incredibly heavy, and it was the first time she had taken up the sword that day. But then, suddenly, she became a little sad, and said that she didn't really know if she could repay them for such kindness. But then suddenly Ethan, turning away from her, said that she could certainly not worry about that. Rolie was getting worried and said that she actually deserved to be punished, but he was still incredibly kind to her. The man extended his fist forward and said that his goal was actually to take care of her, so he didn't see any problem. The girl immediately stretched her hands forward, realizing that he wanted to give her something for sure, and she too wondered what it could be. Soon Ethan loosened his hand, and a red pebble fell into her palm. She looked at him in surprise and wondered why he was giving it to her. Ethan replied that there was no particular reason for that. However, this stone had one peculiarity, so it was better for her to carry it with her all the time. When Rolie heard about it, she was immediately interested. She had never heard of stones with any peculiarities before, and thought it sounded unusual and even interesting. Then the girl began to look at it carefully and put it close to her and said that it had an incredibly beautiful color and added that she would always keep it with her. So she thanked him from the bottom of her heart for it. For a while, Ethan just stared at the girl and then he turned and walked away. In fact, he had the exact same stone hanging on his chest with a special garter. However, he hid it so that the girl would not notice it. Ethan had always hoped that the color of this stone would never change, and believed that absolutely everything would be fine. But one day, the worst thing he could have imagined happened. As he walked through the woods looking for Rolie, he saw her. She was lying on the cold ground, covered in her own blood. The man immediately ran up to her and started shouting her name. He lifted her face from the cold ground and couldn't believe it had really happened. Ethan moved closer to her and told her that she shouldn't have died, and added that he would never forgive the man who had done this to her. He then removed the red stone and placed it in her hand, thinking of how he could never forgive even this miracle that never happened. In fact, in that world, lineage was the very blessing of the world, and Ethan just had no way of knowing why he should see poor Rolie bloodied. He had no intention of sending her to that place, probably death. However, everything happened in the most terrible way. The carriage crashed, and the coachman who accompanied the girl also died. In fact, to the man, his lineage was but a fetter that always restrained his impulses. Ethan immediately picked up the girl and brought her back to the manor, where maids were running and fussing, trying to stop her bleeding. They kept talking about being faster. By then, Rowley wasn't breathless. She had a chance of surviving. Ethan, along with his father, stood back and just watched the maids try to do something. Soon a man came up to His Majesty and, bowing, said that a little more and she would certainly have died. That man was Malson Xavier, who was a surgeon at Asburn College Medical School and was the very best at what he did. Ethan turned to him and asked how the girl was. The man, sighing heavily, said that fortunately the wound was not fatal, but she was bleeding too much, which could complicate the situation. As a consequence, her extremities are cold and her pulse is too slow. She also has a severe head injury. Malson was covered in blood and, wiping his forehead with sweat, said that if he left her in such a state, it would be very difficult for her to get out of an incident like this. But Ethan said he had to save her, no matter what it cost him. The man got a little nervous and wanted to object, but the guy waved his hand in his direction and said he hadn't brought him here to hear dry facts. He looked straight at the doctor and told him to use all methods, legal or illegal, he didn't care. He also said that if need be, he could even sell his soul, but he would definitely have to save her. Ethan also told him to take a chance and use his new method he has if he doesn't want his family to get hurt. Malson, upon hearing this, immediately became anxious. He said he was still busy studying it. The experiment had only worked with a dog and a sheep, so he wasn't sure if it could work on a human. Ethan asked the doctor to tell him as much as possible about this method, and then he would make a final decision. The doctor said it's called a blood transfusion, a procedure in which a patient is given a missing amount of blood. When the man heard this, he was very surprised. He had actually never heard of such a thing before. And Malson said that for this procedure, they would need 20 drops of opium, ammonia oil, and someone to give blood for the girl. Ethan, not thinking long, immediately said that in that case he could do it, and the doctor, hearing this, was very surprised. The man immediately started to discourage him and said that they should use the blood of others. However, the guy had already started to take off his shirt and asked if he could just do it without any further interruptions. Then his father came up to him and said that the doctor, after all, says that this has never been conducted on humans, so he wants them to use someone else's blood that won't be as precious as his. Malson agreed with him and said that if anything happened to him, he would be a corpse. But Ethan didn't want to hear anything. He had already undressed and said that they should worry about the girl, not him. The doctor once again tried to talk him out of it, but Ethan was serious and said that if they didn't want to die on the spot, they should do as they were told. Soon they had done what was needed after all, and the girl was already lying on the bed, changed into clean clothes and resting. The doctor, who was nearby, said that he thought they had missed something important. Ethan didn't listen to him, however. He exhaled with relief and said that he had done a very good job. And then he looked at the stone in his hand. The Ramian was red again, which meant it had worked. The doctor said to keep an eye on her for a while after she wakes up. Ethan, without turning around, replied that he would do everything. The doctor, however, asked that he leave the rest to him. At that moment, one of the knights came into their room, and Ethan said he had instructed him to inquire into the circumstances of what had happened. The boy replied that that was exactly what he was doing. Even though they had looked all around the carriage and around the village, it wasn't easy to find footprints because it was still snowing. The man looked at him and said that after all, he couldn't have traveled that far because of the blizzard, so he must be somewhere nearby. He asked that the knights do their best. The man replied that of course they would do their best. His assistant was silent for a while and then turned to His Highness and said that he was very uncomfortable talking about it. However, he asked what to do if they suddenly found Zenon Clark. The knight inquired if they would have to kill him. Ethan was silent for a while, and then, looking at his beloved who lay dying, he said they had better bring him back alive. In fact, he hadn't been able to figure out what was between them for a long time now. One day, Rowley called him and said she wanted to talk to him. And then the girl said she was getting married. The man could not believe that it really happened because it was quite sudden. She replied that she understood perfectly well that the social life was not suitable for her. However, she still wanted to find her happiness in this life. Roella assured him that Mr. Clark was a very good man, but Ethan tried to talk her out of it. The girl, smiling gently at him, replied that her father had already arranged everything with him and left, so now she certainly had no choice. She bowed and asked him to give her his consent to the marriage. When Ethan heard this, he realized that this girl was also the child of a noble family. She had no other choice. She could not go against her parents. And even though he was thus losing her, he had to give his consent. In his opinion, Roella was too beautiful to live under the young duke's rule, and he could not believe that she should really agree to that proposal, even though she wouldn't be happy in that relationship. At that moment, when the whole situation of the accident happened, the man continued to sit near the girl without moving away, as suddenly someone knocked on his door and entered. And it was one of the knights. He immediately said hello to Ethan, and the man immediately inquired if they had found anything. The knight said that they unfortunately couldn't find Zenon Clark. It had already snowed too much, so they couldn't even find a single trace of him. When the man heard this, he immediately thought about it. He remembered the girl saying that he had promised her that he would make her happier. However, he didn't understand where those promises had gone. Before the wedding, Roella must have wished to meet Clark's family. However, after the footmen were killed, he simply disappeared without a trace from the carriage in which the two of them were traveling. And there was only one memory left of him. At that moment, when the man was thinking about all this, the girl suddenly began to breathe heavily and wheeze. Ethan immediately turned to the knight, who was still in his room, and asked that he summon a healer now. The man, not thinking long, immediately rushed to the door and said he would do it right away. In fact, the girl started to wake up. Then Ethan, moving closer to her, asked if she was all right and how she was feeling. She suddenly said in a quiet voice for him to leave this place, even if he stayed in the palace. Ethan, however, let her words pass through his ears. He told Roella that he had been worried about her all this time. But at that moment, his conversation was interrupted by a man who came into the room. It was his father. He was in uniform, and also his name was Cedric. He was also the Duke of Lorraine. The man immediately approached Ethan and asked how he even dared to use personal troops without his own permission. The son looked at him and replied that it was a matter of life and death, so he simply had no choice. Cedric continued to shout and wondered if he himself didn't know that his word was far more important than some woman's. He also added that the guy is, after all, the only man who can inherit his title, and wondered if he didn't understand at all what that meant. He stepped even closer to his son, saying in a quiet voice that only Ethan could continue the Bertrand family, so he couldn't use his position for personal gain. The boy was very angry with his father over these words and only said in a low voice that it was not a personal matter at all. He explained that 2 people had already died, and the girl would have died too, just a little bit more. Then suddenly, Cedric, with absolutely no reaction whatsoever, asked the boy to get her out of the place. Ethan, when he heard this, was very surprised. However, their conversation was interrupted by a knight who ran into the room with the doctor. The man bowed immediately, greeting them both, and Ethan introduced his father to the doctor, who was the very best in their empire. But the man replied that there was no need for him in that place, so he said he could leave in peace. The doctor was surprised to hear this, and Ethan thought that he was afraid of his father, but that he knew him better than anyone else. Then the man turned to his father and said that the fellow was Melson Xavier, Dean of the Faculty of Medicine at Aspen College. He had also heard that many of his students were serving the royal court. He then asked the doctor if it was true that the king was still interested in Lorraine. De Melson immediately bowed and said that this was indeed the case. Then he turned to the emperor and asked him not to favor one of his subjects and not to look down on him. He shifted his gaze to Roella, who was still lying on the bed, and said he was talking about this poor girl who was in incredibly great danger. Cedric looked at the doctor for a while, then shifted his gaze to his son and with a heavy sigh told them to take care of her after all. He then turned and left the room, closing the door behind him with a clatter. Ethan immediately turned to the doctor, who came over to examine the girl, and inquired how she was doing in general. The man examined her wounds and said that she had been moving her lips for a while, so it shouldn't be long before she regained consciousness. After examining the girl for some more time, he said that she was unconscious for the moment, so it was most likely involuntary movements. Melson explained that because she hit her head hard, there could be problems when she regained consciousness. When Ethan heard this, he was very surprised and immediately wondered what problems he was even talking about. The man said that if the patient has been unconscious for an extended period of time, he may begin to see hallucinations upon awakening. And in some cases, he even earns a mental disorder that is not easily cured. And sometimes it is not treated at all, remaining with the patient for the rest of his life. After that, he shifted his gaze to Roella, who was still lying unconscious, and said that he only had to wait for the lady to wake up. Some more time had passed since then, and Ethan continued to stay by the girl's side every minute. The maids who were passing by began to gossip. One of them said that she was afraid that if His Highness continued to sit there all the time, he would lose a lot of weight. They were very worried about it, for it had been the 10th day since he had been there by the girl's side and had not moved away at all. Another maid suggested that his heart was probably shattered, for he was very dear to Mrs. Verdiviere. In fact, throughout the days, Ethan had been around the girl, constantly thinking about what he should say when she woke up. He searched for appropriate phrases to make it less awkward, so he decided not to have a serious conversation to begin with. But in the end, when Roella woke up, she called him Mr. Clark, and Ethan, upon hearing it, was just mortified. He couldn't even get a word in edgewise, so he quickly returned to his office and got down to business. Soon his aide came to the man and told him that Clark was vociferously assuring him that his son couldn't have done it. He said that Zenon absolutely could not have taken the life of such a beautiful creature. Ethan, still sorting through the paperwork, said that in that case he assumed they hadn't contacted his cousin from Helmut either. However, his assistant responded that they had been in touch, but the guy had about the same reaction. And also, it seems to him that Mrs. Verdinode's father has left Lorac. When Ethan heard this, he was very surprised and asked if a man who was so sick really did such a thing. His assistant was also a bit disturbed and said that this was indeed the case. He decided to marry off his daughter and eventually left, apparently to live for himself. But Ethan, after thinking about the whole situation, said that was totally not true, and he realized that there was something in all of this that he didn't know. After a while of silence, the boy turned to an aide named Orknell. He immediately came close to him and said that he would do whatever he said. Ethan said that man wasn't from Lorac. When it was, he did not know exactly, but Roella had come to this place as a child. So he asked that the man try to find out from the people Fadenode worked for where he was even from. Orknell, bowing, told His Highness that of course he would fulfill everything and would try to do so as soon as possible. But before the man left, and there also asked that he check to see if the man had told anyone anything personally in the nearby taverns. But then suddenly his assistant objected and said that he had heard that usually this man didn't drink at all, and when the guy heard that, he was very surprised. It was really a surprise to him, for being engaged in such dangerous and arduous work, he had avoided in every possible way the drink that could more than any other relax him. Then, after a little silence, he told the aide that he understood everything, and also added to go to fulfill his duties. But Orknell, stopping, said that the whole point was that he wished to inquire if he had visited Mrs. Wediver lately. Ethan, hearing about this question, was very surprised, and after that he sighed heavily and said that the girl first of all needed peace, so he didn't want to overload her too much. He also told the deputy that for some reason she was mistaking him for Non-Clark. If he went there, he would only make things worse. However, his assistant objected and said that the doctor was all about her needing support from someone she was fairly familiar with in order for her to come to her senses and not complicate this situation. Orknell lowered his head, realizing that if he said too much, he would be punished. But he still said that the lady didn't even know why she was in this place, and if she was going to lie here with a bunch of questions, he doubted it would do her any good. He asked that the man do it at least for Mrs. Verdi, for he thought it might do her a great deal of good. Ethan, however, became more than a little angry and asked in a gruff voice, "Do I really have to come and play Zenon Clark too?" He asked the assistant if he really thought he should do that. Orknell remained silent for some time longer. He did not know what to say to this, and then, when he was about to say his words, a maid suddenly burst in. The woman looked very worried and, turning to Ethan, said that he should go to Mrs. Verdiver right now. The man had no choice, for he realized that something serious must have happened, so he went straight to her bedroom. As soon as he entered, he saw many maids standing around the girl's bed. He asked what had happened. The maids, seeing Ethan, immediately started whispering. Then they moved away from the girl's bed, and he saw what was wrong with her. Rolly continued to sit on the bed and cry loudly. When he saw this, he immediately turned to her and asked what had happened. The girl, hearing his voice, looked up at once and was very glad to see Mr. Clark. For the time being, she was a little even calmer. No doubt the man did not like the way she called him. However, he came closer and asked why she was crying like that. Then, looking at him with tearful eyes, she said that her pendant had disappeared. When he heard this, he immediately replied that she could not possibly find the red crescent moon pendant, but that she had it, so she need not worry. Afterward, he sighed heavily, looked angrily at the maids, and asked, "Is this the only reason they made such a fuss?" Rowella, who was on the verge of crying again, apologized to him and told him that she didn't understand what was going on at all, and besides, no one wanted to tell her anything. She explained that this pendant was a very important thing to her, so she became concerned when she saw that it was not near her. Ethan was very surprised to hear this, for he had never realized before that she thought he was so important. Then she looked at Mr. Clark and wondered where His Excellency was now, for she must speak to him as soon as possible. The man was silent for a while, and then he started to turn around and leave. When the girl saw this, she was very surprised and asked what was going on. However, he didn't answer her anything. He walked over to his assistant, who wanted to say something, but he ignored his words and asked everyone present to leave, for he would like to speak privately with Rowella. In fact, 8 years ago, winter in Lorec was incredibly hard. That year was dry and a complete crop failure. The inhabitants starved to death one by one, and the people who were accustomed to work with sickle and pickaxe had to climb the mountain to catch wild animals and somehow feed their families. In an abandoned tower on the outskirts lived a girl, and her name was Rowella. She did not live there alone, but with her father. One sunny morning, a man approached her one day and asked if she was going to go to Mount Nodalt again that day. The girl, smiling, said that of course she was just about to go there, and in the meantime she was sitting at her textbooks, for she was very fond of learning a lot of new things. The man, smiling, said that there were a lot of people there at the moment, and they had gone there to catch wild boar, so it is very dangerous to be there. Rowella looked at him and replied that there was a very useful plant on this mountain. They say that you should put ointment on wounds, and then it will cure everything. However, since it can be incredibly painful, she will add an herb with an analgesic effect to this ointment. When her father heard such information, he was very surprised, for he had never heard of such a thing before. And his daughter replied that she had read in a book that the Hilturari flower from Mount Nodalt had this effect. He stepped closer to her and couldn't believe that she was really so smart and knew so much. Rowella smiled and told her father to let her go. The man tried to insist and said that he would be very worried, for, as he had said, it was very dangerous there. However, the girl wondered why he would be worried, because he was talking about helping people, and that's what she wanted to do. He fixed her hair and said that he was certainly not recanting, but everything had its pros and cons. He, seated beside her, said that her help could bring both good and bad things for people. But the girl looked at him and replied that if she knew a way to help someone, she wouldn't just sit idly by. The man was silent for a while. Then he embraced his dear daughter and asked that she return before sunset. Rowella was at once glad that he had allowed her to go, and so she thanked him for it. Soon after, she packed up and went to the mountain. She had a special basket in her hand so that she could collect the plant she had come for. She would leave special ribbons on the trees so that she could return from the forest. When she turned the corner, she saw some unusual trees, which surprised her because she had never seen them before. Then, looking down, she saw a huge footprint on the ground and assumed that there were probably wild boars in this forest. Rowella was very worried, for she did not want to get into trouble, and she realized that she had best take a different road so that she would not run into danger. But the moment she turned her head to the side, she saw just the flowers she needed growing under the tree. When she saw them, she got very excited and immediately ran over to pick them off. Many hours had passed since then. She had walked through the woods and collected many different seedlings, and eventually she had a whole basket of the flowers she wanted. It was already beginning to get dark outside. She cut the flowers on purpose so that new stems would soon grow there. When she looked up, having finished all her chores, she noticed that the sun was already setting, which meant she needed to hurry up so her father wouldn't worry so much. But as she looked around, Rowella couldn't see which tree she had tied the ribbon on. The girl even walked a few steps forward and noticed that for some reason she wasn't there, although she definitely came with a yellow ribbon and marked her entire path with it. She shifted her gaze to her basket and couldn't believe that she had accidentally not thought and left it at the bottom. As she was about to check it out, she suddenly saw the silhouette of a person between the trees. She immediately asked in a frightened voice who it was, and the black-haired boy, also seeing her, began to draw his sword and said that he should be the one to ask her who dared to suddenly enter their territory. Of course, that boy was Ethan. They stood there for a while, staring at each other angrily. Rowella examined him from all sides and noticed that he was dressed neatly and spoke arrogantly, so she assumed that he was an aristocrat. However, she couldn't figure out what he was doing in this place. The boy continued to draw his sword and asked that she answer his question immediately. Rowella knew she had better introduce herself, so she bowed and gave a false name, for she didn't want to say her real one. She introduced herself as Leota Jasons. He then pointed to some yellow ribbons and wondered if they were hers. Ethan also explained that Nodalt was privately owned by the Bartrand family and wondered if she didn't know that they couldn't be left behind. Rowella replied in a stern voice that she had been afraid of getting lost and had therefore left them on the road without a second thought. If she had known it was forbidden, she would never have done it, of course. When Ethan heard those words, he immediately thought about it. Surely there was no sign of other people, which meant that she must be telling the truth. And she was just a child, so she didn't have evil intentions. He was silent for a while, and afterward inquired what was in her basket. Rowella quickly hid it behind her back and said there was nothing there. The boy then insisted, reaching his hand forward and telling her to give it to him. He said he didn't know if she had done anything forbidden, but he had to make sure, so he insisted. Rowella, suddenly indignant, said that Duke Loreco had allowed all subjects to hunt on Mount Nodalt, which meant that it was okay to gather herbs in that place as well. She also added that she didn't have to show him because she collected them quite legally, and she also said that he's probably not a duke after all. When the guy heard this, he was very surprised, and the girl continued to assert her rights and said that he didn't say who he was, so she didn't know how she should address him. In fact, Ethan couldn't believe that she had actually addressed him in such a disrespectful tone. At that moment, the voices of the knights behind him sounded, addressing him as a young duke. The men quickly ran up to him, then one of them, getting down on one knee, inquired of the young duke if he was all right, and also if he was not wounded. He also said in a worried voice that if he disappeared alone like this, he didn't even know what he should do, because there were a lot of hunters on Nodalt, so it was dangerous to be in that place. He added that he could get into trouble that way. Ethan, indignant, wondered if they really thought he was inexperienced enough to be a threat to these hunters. Rowella, when she heard this boy being called a young gentleman, was immediately very frightened. Taking a closer look at his uniform, she noticed the Bartrand family insignia there, a white-tailed eagle as a badge on his chest. The girl realized that she had made the greatest mistake, so, Falling at his feet, she begged the young duke's forgiveness for such disrespect she had shown him. She replied without raising her eyes that she was very stupid and did not know what he looked like, so she had taken the mortal sin of talking to him like that. A knight suddenly approached her and inquired who she was and what she was doing on this mountain so late. Rowella looked at him and said that she lived in a tower on the outskirts. When he heard this, he said that she must be Fadnod's daughter. Ethan, who continued to stand behind him, looked at his assistant and wondered if he knew her. The man smiled and said that was right. He knew where she lived and who she was, so she certainly didn't carry a threat to them. Then the boy asked if he could walk her downstairs straight to the house because it was getting dark and it might be too dangerous. And besides, she had lost all her bearings. The man did not question what he was even talking about, but after listening to the young lord, he immediately sent one knight along with the girl to take her away. When they'd gotten far enough away, Ethan immediately turned to the aide and wondered how he even knew her. Orknell, smiling, replied that he himself was seeing her for the first time, but that the abbot had told him of her several times. He also said that he had been told that she had read absolutely every book that was in the abbey. Ethan, hearing this, was immediately interested and asked if this was really true. And the man said that this is the purest truth. Only a 12-year-old child, and she already enjoys adult and complex medical literature, so she is very well remembered by him. He thinks it's just something incredible. The boy was left staring off into the distance and wondering about Cheetah, and he immediately wondered who she even was, as well as why she gave a fake name. Rowella continued walking towards her home and realized that she would have been much better off getting to know the young duke the first time. She remembered the stories of people saying that the Bartrand family's sole heir was very cold. And they say his father's temper isn't the best either. They said that he was demanding of cleanliness and arrogant, so that if one slip-up was made, the end would come. He especially does not forgive liars for anything. When the girl remembered all the gossip, she realized that, although it was a mistake to make up her real name, suggested that it was probably even for the best. She realized that everything would go well and they would never see each other again. So she didn't know if she had met a man of noble lineage face to face like this for the only time in her entire life. However, it was a very interesting opportunity and experience for her. A few days had passed since then, and Rowella had made a special ointment, as she had intended. The guy who was always buying things from her took this ointment too. He said that it was really very effective, and his mother's wound healed immediately. The girl, smiling happily, told him to apply the next portion twice a day in amounts as large as a thumbnail. He thanked her, and also told her that the medicine for his uncle from the pharmacy did not help, and was very expensive, but her medicine was more useful, and all the people in the village knew it too. Rowella, laughing, replied that she had just made it from herbs from the mountain, so anyone could do something like that, as long as they knew how to do it. But the guy, indignant, replied that it is not true at all because she has abilities. And besides good medicine, she does not take money and just give it to people. The girl answered Simon that she just wanted to help people. That's why she didn't take payment. After that, she handed him the pouch and said that she brought it today. Put more in it than usual because of the fact that she would spend some time making a new ointment. She thought it would be hard to contact afterward. When Simon heard this, he was very surprised and asked the girl if she would no longer make medicine for them all. But she replied that that wasn't true at all. It was just that as long as the hunting season lasted, she would not go to the mountain to gather ingredients there. She remembered the crown prince angrily inquiring what she was doing on his property, and realized she didn't even want to poke around there anymore for a while. And after a little thought, she said she would never go there again, because it wasn't worth it. After that, Rowella went to the market. She kept thinking about Simon and the fact that his youngest was malnourished, so she gave him everything she had. Before the guy left, she gave him a potato and said that unfortunately she didn't have anything else, but she was glad to give him at least that. As she picked up some more potatoes for herself, she thought that perhaps she should sell them all and buy new bags of ointment. But when she thought about it, she realized that she needed to put at least 2 potatoes in the soup and she could sell the rest. After some more thought, she decided to take 3 potatoes. However, at that moment, someone called out to her. She immediately turned around when her name was called to see who it was. There was a large and pumped-up man walking straight toward her, who, upon seeing her face, said that she was definitely the Rowella. The girl recognized him too. It was Grandpa Gorner, and she said hello as he came closer. The man, however, was not in the best of moods, and said in a rough voice that he had heard of many people saying that she made good medicine, and that through her ointment, Madame Annette had cured her shoulder and Generita her wound. Rowella was a little wary and said that it was all really true. The man reached forward and asked her to give him some. He pointed to his sore finger and asked that she really give it to him, for Rowella became uneasy. Because of this, she replied that she was now out of all the ointment, and so she also apologized for that. But when the man heard this, he said indignantly that if she had no ointment, she would make it. He grabbed her shoulder, and the girl replied in a quick voice that if she was going to make the salve, she would have to go to the mountain. And it was very dangerous there because of hunting season, and she had promised her father not to go there for a while. But the man kept insisting and said that he was already telling her that the matter was urgent and he needed it immediately. He said that his finger would start to abscess very soon, and this was a very dangerous and serious matter. He continued to squeeze the girl's shoulder as hard as he could. Rowella became very frightened by this. She tried to pull his hand away, saying she was in a lot of pain. He suddenly noticed the basket she was holding and asked angrily, "Is that where she's hiding the ointment?" She said that of course there was nothing in there, but only groceries. But he did not believe her and grabbed her by the arm. He continued to yell almost to the whole street, saying that she must have hidden the ointment there and wouldn't give it to him for some personal conviction. Rowella tried to pull out of his arms and talked about how of course she wasn't hiding anything, and begged him to let her go because she was in a lot of pain, and mentally asked for her father's help. And at that moment she suddenly heard someone's voice turning to her uncle and telling him to let go of her hand. The man immediately wondered who was so bold, so he turned around and asked what he was saying. But no sooner had he finished his sentence than a sharp sword was presented to his throat. He was immediately frightened and saw a young black-haired man in front of him who said that if he said one more word, he would cut off his head. When Rowella looked at her rescuer, she immediately recognized it was Ethan, and that surprised her greatly. Behind the boy were some guards who followed him everywhere to guard him. The people who crowded around after hearing the whole scandal and seeing the young Duke of the Bertrand family couldn't believe that it was really true. At this point, the man finally let go of Rowella and apologized to the man with his hands in the air. At this moment, a senior knight came up to them and inquired about why he was making so much noise in this place. The man was very worried. He said that he didn't want to do anything wrong, but that the little girl had lied to him, so he had to go to a more brutal measure. When Rowella heard this, she became very indignant and said that she hadn't actually lied to him. But the man, interrupting her, replied, turning to the young Duke, that this girl was using cunning tricks, making and selling unauthorized medicines, and thereby powdering people's minds. Rowella stared straight into Ethan's eyes for a while. There was no emotion in them, just as there was on his face. Then the knight approached them again and inquired what unauthorized medicines were even in question. And Uncle said it was just so. They are very unresolved, for it's rather suspicious that she climbs up the mountain every day, tearing herbs and making various ointments out of them. Then the knight looked at the girl and asked if it was true, and also inquired about the medicine she had finally prepared. Rowella was very worried. Her hands began to shake, and she said she had made an ointment to apply to people's wounds from cuts from tree branches. She said she was only helping them to heal, and nothing bad had ever entered her mind. She had never even taken money for it. In a sad voice, she also added that she just knew the method of preparation. So she made the medicine and only shared it with people who really needed it. Rowella explained that most people in this place cannot afford to buy medicine even if they are sick. They have nothing to eat, so medicine is out of the question. She also said that was why she just read medical books and repeated what was written there. The effect was good, so she decided to share with people who really needed it. The residents immediately agreed and said that if it wasn't for this child, they would have suffered greatly, so were grateful to be able to heal quickly and get back on their feet thanks to her herbs and ointments. But then suddenly the uncle, who continued to stand by, got angry and said that this girl was evil. He had heard that she was collecting belladonna, making and selling drugs even. When the people heard this, they were very surprised and could not believe that Panadot was manufacturing all this together with her. Rowella rose to her defense. She began to shout that it was all some kind of nonsense. She swore even by God that she had never done anything like that, but only served for the good of the people. But the man kept pointing his finger at her and talked about her being a liar and a sly girl. Also said she was just a witch who wished all the residents evil. He also added that she looks petite and unprotected, but is definitely a witch. But at that moment, Eaton spoke. He turned to his assistant and asked that he take the man away already at last. Seeing his surprised face, the guy wondered why, if he thought she was a witch who sold and did strange things, he wanted to suddenly get a cure from her. He also added that just 5 minutes ago, he was shouting at the whole square and demanding to get the medication from her. The man saw that the Crown Prince had touched his sword again and was very frightened, so he didn't reply anything. Eaton said that if his words were indeed true, he must have wanted the drugs that were made by the witch. The man said that this was not true at all. However, he did not reply that it was quite enough for him to make a ruckus in the square, so much so that he dared to denounce another person while lying. So he turned to Orknell and asked him to take him to the cadre. The man bowed and said that of course he would do so. Some of the knights immediately grabbed him and began to lead him away. The man started lashing out and shouting for forgiveness, for it was his fault. Then Eaton addressed the girl by the false name which she then called. She immediately fell on her knees, and the guy said that it was really illegal to sell unauthorized drugs and to manufacture them as well. She immediately apologized to him, saying she didn't do it on purpose. At that moment, her father's voice was heard through the crowd shouting her name and trying to get close to her. After a while, he finally did make it through the crowd and ran up to the girl and hugged her, asking her what had happened. She hugged him back. Then his voice became very serious. He asked the girl to be polite and, bowing, turned to the young duke, saying that he was Rowella's father. He called his name Panadoth, and the girl at that moment was simply terrified, for she realized that she had been caught in a deception about her real name. She knew that the young duke would never forgive those who lied about themselves. Eaton was silent for a while, staring at the girl without breaking his gaze. She continued to sit on the floor, shaking with fear. After a while, the guards and the Crown Prince turned around and just started walking away. Rowella continued to sit on the floor and couldn't believe that he had really just turned around and walked away, and didn't even chastise her for lying to his face. Suddenly, the father hugged his daughter again and asked if she was all right. She immediately apologized to him, saying that she should have listened to him from the beginning. But the man, taking her hand, replied that it was all right. It was definitely all right now. So he suggested that they go home as soon as possible and rest after all these incidents. Soon they were off in the direction of home, and Rowella replied to her father that he surely knew how scary the dark could be, so she would never act in her own way again. The man, upon reflection, replied that if there was light, surely there would be light. He also added that she had helped all those people and had done a good thing, but still, surely something bad could happen. At this very time, Eaton had already returned to his estate as well. The aide asked him why he hadn't asked anything. The boy looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The man, handing him the blade, replied that he meant the girl who lived in the stone tower. Eaton, sitting down in his chair, wondered if he was referring to that Rowella. Orknell thought of the fact that the Lord could surely have guessed and realized that her name was quite different. Then the boy, turning to him, said that he had told him, after all, that she was the daughter of a laborer, so very soon they would meet again. He explained that the crime had to be answered properly so as not to complicate things further. When Orknell heard this, he was very surprised. He couldn't understand what was in this guy's head at all and what ideas were going through his head. As he left, he said that the man would have martial arts training very soon. Ethan continued to sit in his chair and replied that he hadn't forgotten, so he would be getting ready soon. Soon afterward, Rowella was very excited, for her father's forehead was very hot. The man, who couldn't even get out of bed, told her not to worry, because he would soon get a good night's sleep, and he would definitely feel better. However, she insisted and said that she had read about such a thing in a book. Such a prolonged high temperature could be very dangerous. But the man kept insisting and said he was really fine, so she'd better not think about unnecessary things. Rowella looked at her father with pain in her eyes and realized that all he needed was the bark of the Dodosha tree and belladonna leaves to get rid of this terrible fever. So she packed up again and headed for the mountain, thinking that this would only be the last time. Soon, she found the very thing she needed. When Rowella saw this plant, she was overjoyed and thought it was great luck to find the belladonna first. After gathering what she needed, she looked around and realized that the only thing left to find was the Dodosha tree. After a while, she was able to find it. She peeled the bark off of it, and as she looked around, she saw that already the sun was going over the horizon. After walking some distance back, she realized that she had gone too deep, and without the markings, she didn't even know the direction. She sat down on a rock to eat something to eat, as she had been in the forest all day. But she decided not to worry about it too much, and thought about the fact that she had managed to gather all the herbs, so all she had to do was go downstairs. Rowella remembered the survival book she'd read, and knew that the side with the most moss was the north side, so she had to go down that ridge of the mountain. She had been walking for a long time, and soon she saw a neat and well-traveled path with bushes. She realized that it was the kind of path that people usually took. This thought made the girl madly happy, and she mentally thanked the Lord for taking pity on her. She had finally found the path where someone was, and that made her madly happy. But when she got on that path, she suddenly saw a place she shouldn't have gone in. At this very time, Mr. Eaton was in the courtyard practicing swordsmanship, as was the plan. After a short fight, the opponents retreated, and the fellow, breathing heavily, said he had been a good opponent. And when they were about to continue the fight, the boy suddenly heard some strange sounds in the bushes nearby. He was sure he heard something, but when he turned his head, there was nothing there. At that moment, the guy who had attacked the young Duke hurt his hand. He didn't expect this to happen, for he thought he would defend himself as usual. He immediately walked over to Ethan and asked if he was all right, for his entire arm was now covered in blood. But Ethan paid no attention to him. He turned back to the bushes, and as he opened them, he was very much surprised to see the girl there and asked, "Is it really her again?" It was indeed so. Rowella was sitting in the bushes with a basket filled with various herbs and plants. She tearfully apologized to the Lord at once. He, putting away his sword, inquired whether she had dared to enter unauthorized, and also asked how she had come to this place in the first place. She put her head down in shame and said that she was just lost and was traveling down the ridge in a southerly direction, but ended up in the wrong place. Ethan interrupted her and said that he'd already told her that it was illegal to manufacture unapproved drugs, and looked at the basket filled with plants. Rowella immediately said that the condition of his arm was far more important right now, and that she had herbs could be sorted out later. When he looked at the hand that his opponent had cut him, he realized that it really didn't look very attractive. He also thought about the fact that in order to judge whether her treatment was witchcraft or not, he would just have to check for himself. So without thinking long, Ethan asked her to cure him. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised and said that she was not a doctor and could not do such things. Then he said, frowning, that since she was not a doctor, how could one understand the manufacture of the ointment she was distributing to everyone in town? Rowella realized she was wrong. She looked down and didn't say anything because she didn't know what to say. When Ethan's adversary, who was standing nearby, heard all this, He looked at the girl in surprise and couldn't believe that this was really the same child who had stirred up the whole neighborhood. He had heard that the day they had taken Gaunter away, she had almost been punished too. He shifted his gaze to the Crown Prince and had no way of understanding why the guy was even acting like this. This behavior was completely unnatural for him. Ethan was silent for a while, then motioned for the girl to speak. He also called her a fake name. Rowella immediately turned to him and said she had something to say. She wasn't really who she said she was when she first met him. She said her true name, but the man said it didn't matter at all who she was. Anyway, that name didn't matter. When Rowella heard this, she looked at him in surprise and couldn't believe that he had actually said it. Guy explained that he meant that he didn't care if she was punished for trespassing or killed because his mood was ruined. The girl realized that no matter how much she begged, he still wouldn't let her go home before he did what the young duke wanted. She realized that all she could do was not disturb his peace. So Rowella turned to him and told him that she couldn't make the ointment from herbs alone. She would need a few more ingredients. Ethan, fixing his hair, said that so be it. He'd give her whatever she needed, and in return, she had to do her best if she wanted to continue to live up to her name. She immediately agreed, and after that all three of them went to the manor. The man threw his cloak over his shoulders so the others wouldn't see his wounds. The maids, when they saw them pass by, began to whisper, as they had never seen this girl before. Soon they entered the room, and Ethan said she could begin now. Rowella lowered her head and said she had to take off her shirt first so she could get a good look at the wound. The guy, without thinking long, took off his shirt. His body was pretty pumped since he works out a lot, but the wound was really deep and wide. The girl tried not to look at his body and said that fortunately she had her collected herbs and trichosanth that could relieve his pain. But she also said she would need a spoonful of linseed oil, some bitter golda skins, a small stone mortar, and a lancet as an antiseptic. Then Ethan turned to Ginon, with whom he had just been training, and asked that he tell Orknell to bring whatever this girl had asked for. The boy bowed and said he would do it right away, then left, and Rowella began to pull the blood from the Lord's arm and noticed that the wound was much deeper than she had even imagined. Ethan, too, was beginning to get a little worried, for he was really hurting. Then he looked at the girl and said that if she was surprised at such a wound, he doubted she could heal at all. She ignored his remark and immediately began to trample herbs in order to prepare a special medicine. She immediately remembered Hawk's words, calling her a blessing from God that didn't descend on everyone, and that if people found out, they would just use her. However, she realized that if she didn't try harder right now, she might be in even more danger. So the girl made the ointment according to her conscience. After everything was ready, she applied it to the Crown Duke's hand. And as the ointment began to penetrate his skin, he felt incredible relief. The pain was entirely gone. He was incredibly surprised. Like mine, he immediately looked at her, asking how she had even done it. The girl had even managed to bandage his arm by then. He considered that it was as if she was using healing powers because the effect was exactly the same. But Rowella replied that she usually used dried trichosanthus, but because of the urgency, she just had to increase the amount, and after grinding the herb, she added a few more ingredients. But Ethan interrupted her and said he was asking about how she'd really done it. The girl was surprised at such questions, for she had just told him, and turning away from him, she answered that she had simply mixed the herbs and put them on his hand. There was nothing more to it than that. But at that moment, he suddenly grabbed her arm and pulled her to him. Rowella immediately thought that she was about to be punished. But at that moment, a boy came into the room. It was the one who had trained with the young duke. He said that he had watched the preparation of the medicine from the sidelines, and there was nothing special about it. He also added that if she had been using healing powers, he probably would have noticed it. But as it was, he didn't see anything like that. For a while, he still held her hand and looked the girl straight in the eyes. But soon he let go, calming down a little. He put his bloody shirt back on and said he'd go see his father for now, and asked that the guy keep an eye on this strange girl while he was gone. At this very time in the Duke's study, a fellow named Samuel Gross came into the room. He said he was a pharmacist who sold herbs and medicines in the square. Ethan's father, when he saw him, immediately frowned and wondered what the man had suddenly come for. The man, bowing his head, replied that he was sorry to say that. However, he tried to get away with it, justifying it as a childish prank, but his life depended on it, so he couldn't take it anymore. The man stared at him intently, completely unaware of what he was even talking about. Samuel replied that he was sure that surely the gentleman had not authorized Rowella to make and sell the medicine, and therefore it was very illegal of her to do so. He also said that, in addition, because of this child, the cloth merchant Gauner had been falsely accused and sent to penal servitude. The man replied that he had heard what had happened from a helper, so he was aware of all these cases. When Samuel heard this, he was immediately overjoyed and said that he was very glad that the master already knew about it. And the Duke said that many people say that the medicines that were made by this girl had a very good effect and inquired if this was true. The pharmacist started to get very worried but replied that he didn't know that for sure, because they couldn't call it a medicine just because it worked once or twice. He also said that if things continue like this, the provincial system will collapse, because there are certain laws that must be adhered to. The Duke folded his hands on the papers and said that certainly order should reign in the province. When the pharmacist heard this, he was very happy and thought that it was very good that he and the gentleman agreed. Immediately afterward, Ethan came into their room. He moved closer to his father and suddenly saw Samuel beside him. The one in turn bowed and said that he was the village pharmacist and greeted the young gentleman. The Duke at this point immediately looked more closely at his son and wondered what the blood was on his clothes. Ethan, looking at his sleeve, replied that he had hurt himself while practicing, applied a remedy that had been made by a famous child in the village, and it had healed very quickly, much to his surprise. The man immediately asked what the child's name was. At first, Ethan wanted to give a fake name, but then he realized he had to give the real one, so he called her Rowella. The Duke, upon hearing this, immediately smiled and looked intently at the pharmacist, who was standing there looking incredibly anxious. Afterwards, he said that he silently turned a blind eye to the fact that he had lied about his background and engaged in trading. He did so because he thought that even if the medicine was sold at a higher price than in other places, it was worth it. Of course, as Samuel said, strict order must reign in the market, and that is why he gives Rowella a pharmacist's license. And her ability to make medicine seems to have been confirmed even by his son, so he can't doubt her professional ability. Samuel immediately fell to the ground and told the gentleman that he now did not know how he should be at all, for he had a family of as many as 7 people, and he must feed them all. He said that even now, the children are looking forward to their father finally coming home and perhaps bringing them something good to eat. But the Duke stood his ground and said that those who bought his medicine at a high price also had their own families, so he'd better not use such arguments and go back. Soon after, the guards grabbed him by the arms and began to lead him away. Samuel tried to resist and appeal to his master, but it was no use. After the door had closed, the Duke turned to his son and inquired as to the whereabouts of the unfortunate child. Ethan said she was in his room with Ginnon Clark. The Duke then turned to the guard and asked him to tell Orknoll to bring the child. The man bowed and went straight to the room and was about to call for Rowella. At this very time, the girl stood there incredibly agitated, and Clark tried to calm her down by telling her that she had done a perfect job for the young Duke. He also asked why she suddenly had such a sad expression on her face. Rowella looked away from him and said she was just afraid something bad might happen, that's all. Mr. Clark, however, bowed and said that she did not look like a coward at all after all, and also remembered that he had not yet met her, so he bowed and introduced himself. It was Earl Clark's eldest son, Ginnon, and when the girl heard this, she was very much surprised. She had not expected that he could be a knight. She then curtsied and said her name was Roella Burdiver and also said she was very pleased to meet him. But then the man smiled when he saw her hesitate to do so and decided to change the topic of conversation by asking how she had managed to make that medicine in the first place. She replied that she was just repeating what was written in the book and nothing more. Jeannot replied that if it were that easy, pharmacists and doctors wouldn't be paid so much money to do it. Therefore, he is absolutely certain that there was something more to it than that. After that, he moved closer to her and asked if she could do for him next time too, because when he was practicing, he got too many wounds and they didn't even always have time to heal. But the girl, sighing heavily, said that if she could safely leave the castle, she certainly would. Smiling, he said that she shouldn't worry too much. He didn't know the young duke's exact intentions. However, she had done very well, so he could definitely and even reward her. When Roella heard about the reward, she was very surprised, and the man said that she must have realized by now that he was someone who acted clearly in terms of punishments and rewards. And the girl replied that in that case it was very well, and she calmed down a little. At that moment, the door suddenly opened, and Orknell came into the room. He turned to her and told her that she would have to go along with him. However, when he saw what she was wearing, he said that her outfit would not be too appropriate for this. So the maids came in after him, holding a new dress and shoes in their hands. So immediately after the men came out, they set about dressing and combing the girl's hair. And soon after, Roella was in an incredibly beautiful mauve-colored dress with new earrings and hairpin. Looking at herself, she said she didn't understand why she was given such expensive clothes. The maids immediately laughed and asked her how she even thought. Of course, to meet the provincial ruler, it was a must. When Roella heard this, she was very surprised and didn't expect that she really had to meet the ruler. By then, it had completely started to get dark outside. Her father lay in bed with a fever the whole time, but soon began to wake up and went upstairs to see if she was all right. But when he didn't find her in her room, and generally all over the castle, he went outside and realized that the sun was already setting. The man was incredibly agitated and did not understand where she had gone. But then he suddenly saw a wagon approaching his house. Roella immediately looked out of the window, and seeing her father on the doorstep, she immediately waved and said hello. When the man saw her, he was very surprised and even a little angry. He had not expected to see her in such an outfit. But as soon as the carriage was vacated, she immediately got down and ran up to him and embraced him, saying that it was cold outside, so she didn't understand why he was suddenly outside in his state of health. He, in turn, turned to the girl and asked what was wrong with her clothes. However, he did not have time to say anything because a coachman suddenly came out to them. He had a box in his hand and said that the governor of the province had ordered Miss Burdiver to be escorted out and said it was a present for Miss from Mr. He explained that there was a personal letter from the master inside, so he told them to read it to find out the details.